I think the Quranic depiction of Jesus and his disciples is a clear historical error. The Qur'an claims that Jesus and his disciples were faithful Muslims, but what does the evidence say? Most people only focus on Jesus being a Muslim, but I think it's equally important that the Qur'an praises the disciples, telling us they're rightly guided Muslims, because the evidence of what they believe is even stronger than that of what Jesus believed. Firstly, I want to be really clear before we get into the evidence. I'm not, in this video at least, arguing that the Bible or Christianity is a perfect reflection of the teachings of Jesus or the disciples. Yes, I'm a Christian, but the question I'm tackling today is not, is the Bible reliable? Instead, in this video, I'm arguing that the Quranic view is not compatible with the historical data. There are loads of videos online about biblical reliability. I feel like that's been covered already, and I want to dedicate this space to the Qur'an and my questions with that. That's what this video is about. So in the comments, please don't just go, well, actually, the Bible isn't very reliable because it's irrelevant. Even if the Bible isn't true, even if Christianity isn't true, that doesn't magically mean that the Qur'an is correct and everything it says is right, okay? I'm concerned about the Qur'an. I'm concerned about the historical implications there, and that's the focus of this video. The second thing I want to say is that, just like my last video, which you should definitely watch by the way, I want to say I'm not trying to catch anyone out or offend anyone or anything like that. Obviously, making a video about religion is a very personal subject. This is a genuine question I have that I've found not really any answers to online. People don't really engage with this specific question that I'm asking. I might be wrong about this. I just haven't found anything anywhere, so that's why it's here. That's kind of why this channel exists, is for me to vent my really specific questions that I haven't found any answers to. So if you think I'm wrong, let me know, and I'd love to hear about it. So with that out the way, what exactly does the Qur'an say about the disciples of Jesus? Well, it mentions them in 4 different ayah and establishes that they're aware of Tawheed, inspired by Allah. They describe themselves as Muslims, and in Surah 61, the Qur'an uses them as examples for people in Muhammad's time to follow. But are these helpers of Jesus the same as the 12 disciples described in Christian tradition? Well, I think the answer to that question is yes, an obvious yes. The very word Hawariyun, which is used to describe the helpers of Jesus, is a loanword from Syriac. In Syriac texts and inscriptions, this word is exclusively used to refer to the Christian disciples of Jesus, and even in the Qur'an itself, Hawariyun is exclusive to the people who supported Jesus. No other prophet, just Jesus. I couldn't find any examples of this word being used to refer to anybody but the Christian disciples. It's possible I've missed something, but that means the original audience hearing these ayah in the Qur'an would immediately connect the Hawariyun to the 12 Christian apostles. This is further supported by virtually unanimous consensus among scholars of the Qur'an that these disciples were 12 in number. Some tafsir even go as far to name them, and some give us stories about who they were that match up with the Christian tradition. Now, remember Surah 61, ayah 14? The Qur'an is using the disciples as examples for people in Muhammad's time to follow. By what logic can you make an example of somebody who nobody has any knowledge of? The Hawariyun must have been known to the audience that Muhammad is speaking to. Some apologists, and even in one tafsir that was on the screen before, people argue the disciples may have later apostatized and committed shirk. The problem with that is that Surah 61 beautifully builds this picture of what true faith can do for a believer, and then the example of the disciples is employed. This tells us that they cannot have fallen away from the faith of Islam, because then they would be horrible examples to use if this was the case. Maybe the Qur'an is poor literature, maybe it's not making sense, which I don't think that's true. I think the Hawariyun were consistently loyal to Allah. There is no tradition anywhere of any other group of close followers of Jesus beside these 12 Christian disciples anywhere ever. So if the Qur'an is the perfect and clear book that it claims to be, then it would make zero sense for this to be an unknown group of followers of Jesus unless the author of the Qur'an is intentionally attempting to mislead you about their identity. Okay, so now that we've pretty well established the Hawariyun are the disciples of the Christian tradition, can we know what they preached? Well, we have a pile of writings from the first century of Christianity, and most of them make their way into the Christian New Testament, so we'll start there. It's very important to note, we're not viewing the New Testament as a religious text, we're viewing it as a collection of testimonies that the early Christian community produced. A community in which we'll soon discover the disciples are heavily involved in. There are zero earlier Christian/Jesus related texts than those we find in the New Testament, and we'll go through the other writings and groups after that. So, what is the theology of the Christian New Testament? I'll list a few examples. Just off the top of my head, there's plenty more. This is just what I could think of, and to be honest, until the screen got full as well. According to the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples, they preached Christ crucified and resurrected. This is the atonement of sins. Abrogation through fulfillment of Mosaic law, including dietary requirements, circumcision, which obviously we'll have to come back to.
Animal sacrifices, candles, teaching and atonement. The primary function of the temple against sacrifices. Small temple worship practices such as music and images of heavenly beings. Praying to Jesus. Jesus is the dynamic son of man. Jesus is the judge and judgment. Jesus is the Lord and Savior. Jesus is prayed to the universe. Jesus owns the angels. Affirmation of the Old Testament in present form. New covenant theology. Baptism of the new covenant marker. The Holy Spirit and the Trinity in 99 sense. The gifts of the Holy Spirit, particularly tongues.
And calling God Father. Muslims may argue that the religion could have looked a bit different than the Islam that Muhammad brought, but these are contradictory truth claims to Islam. These are not just Sharia issues, these are religious and historical claims. Any single one of these is enough to disprove the claim that Jesus and his disciples were Muslim. Any single one. Could the early evidence just be so completely wrong? But how involved were the disciples in creating the New Testament? I can already hear you shouting at your screen that they didn't write the New Testament, it wasn't written by any of them. But while that could be true, you must concede it was written in the first century, while many of the disciples are still alive. It was written by at least 9 people, if we're including the Christian apostles, traditional Christian view, but skeptical people would say things like, this isn't the same John, this is not really Peter, and then we can bump that number up to between 15, let's say even 20, early anonymous Christians in that Christian community. The Christian community was well connected. The amount of letters in the New Testament prove that many early Christians were in constant communication. Let's look at just a few examples of that. Revelations is a letter to 7 churches across Asia Minor, which is now in Turkey. 1 Peter is addressed to scattered Christians, telling us there's this interconnected, decentralized community. And obviously this letter is supposedly from Peter. So churches would expect to hear teachings coming from him, so he's clearly involved in the community. In Acts, we read the resolution of the Council of Jerusalem being written in letters and sent to churches internationally. This is a pretty big deal. Even if you want to argue that this is to some degree fabricated history, it's still early Christian testimony of their own community. This is to say, the earliest Christians understand and remember the disciples in Jerusalem to authorize and administer teaching whilst the disciples are still alive. How could that be if they were actively contradicting Christianity? We read about men from James going to Antioch in Galatians 2. This is first-hand eyewitness testimony that the apostles were sending people to regulate the church teaching and practice. Someone had to physically bring Christianity to these regions. Emissaries would travel around delivering these letters, establishing genuine human contact between churches. While some historians theorize that Gentile Christianity differed from Jerusalem community teaching, nobody believes that it could have happened on the scale the Qur'an requires. The Qur'an would need Jerusalem to remain entirely insulated from all other groups and contradict them on an unbelievable amount of foundational core aspects. The appeal to apostolic authority also strengthens this case. It strengthens the case that the teachings provided in the New Testament are coherent with what the disciples were teaching. People expect the disciples' approval on what they teach. If this approval didn't exist because the disciples are really Muslim, how would people be expecting it? Where would this expectation come from? All of this is to say that even if the disciples didn't have a direct hand in any of the New Testament, they didn't write a single thing, they didn't overlook a single piece of writing, they certainly had a massive, massive influence over the theology. Just ask yourself, what are the chances that while the disciples are still alive, they're preaching, all of the early evidence is completely wrong about what they believed and what they taught on a ridiculous number of core issues written by people who think they know them, they think they've met them, and they appeal to their authority to validate what they're teaching? If Muhammad's claims are true, what would we expect the interconnected early Christian community to look like? How would we expect these Christians to remember and understand the disciples? Would we expect the entire early Christian community to be so wrong on so many counts while the disciples are still very much alive with almost no disagreement? Where is the evidence from the real Muslim disciples? What were they preaching? Why is there no disagreement on any of these issues? Surely you'd think at least someone out of the real followers of Jesus would try to correct this. Wouldn't we at least hear about them as heretics from the New Testament community? Why would Allah even allow any of this to happen? Again, I'm not arguing, this is very important, that everything in the New Testament is true. But to argue that there is a silent group of faithful Muslims coexisting alongside a group of people who believe they follow Jesus and even think they know the disciples, they think they've met them, but actually the disciples are part of this secret silent Muslim group, and the New Testament Christians, they're just wrong about everything, it's a bit ridiculous. There's too many questions, there's so much evidence against this, it's overwhelming. I'll now address the fact we do have one recorded countergroup in the New Testament. Are our Muslim disciples hiding here? There was supposedly a group of people who disagreed with the mainstream Christian doctrine that circumcision and dietary restrictions had been lifted. And although we read the disciples sided against this group, that could be some sort of deceitful edit made by the author of Acts because he likes Paul, he wants to make Paul sound better. So even if we ignore the evidence in the Qur'an, funnily enough, and grant that the disciples were preaching circumcision and dietary laws, the list of contradictions looks like this. Again, this is just what I could think of until the slide got full. I'm sure there are plenty more. People probably also want to bring up Galatians 2, where Paul argues with the disciples about dietary issues. So there's a lot going on in the passage there, but essentially it builds a picture that some disciples were in favour of keeping kosher law. Peter is undecided, and obviously Paul, he's against it. Christians reconcile this using Acts 10, where we read Peter has a vision, God declares food clean and Gentiles clean as well, the deeper meaning of that, telling him that Paul is actually correct in this debate. Later, the Council of Jerusalem is formed to solidify that decision and has all of the disciples eventually side with Paul, even if initially they disagreed. As I stated previously, even if Paul was in error on this one disagreement, and acts as lying to make him sound better, the list of contradictions looks like this. Again, this is just what I thought of, and this is how bad it gets. And that feels like quite a nice segue into talking about Paul as well. Did he corrupt the teachings of Jesus? Well, I don't think so, and I think we can show that. We have 3 separate New Testament sources that tell us Paul knew the disciples. One from Paul himself, one from Acts, and one from 2 Peter. Again, even if we're skeptical, it's unlikely that 3 separate individuals would attest to a relationship that simply didn't exist. Also, Paul travelled with Barnabas. This is undisputed, and he was a highly esteemed man to the disciples in the Jerusalem community. Wouldn't Barnabas have something to say if Paul's theology disagreed with the disciples so much? It seems far more likely that there was some endorsement of Paul and his theology, which by and large matched that of the disciples. Paul sometimes quotes Jesus, and if he never physically met Jesus, he would have to have spent time with eyewitnesses to gain this information, again affirming that the eyewitnesses are around, they're partaking in the community, and generally Paul agrees with them. This is all amplified, and this is really the best piece of evidence when you consider Paul joined the movement. He did not create Christianity. There are Christian texts that predate Paul's conversion, or at least his letter writing it, and are written outside of his influence. Paul quotes creeds as pre-existing to himself, and you can clearly see why all of these on the screen are problematic. Almost all scholars agree that these texts are independent of Paul's influence and yet still present serious theological issues for Islam. These texts are especially problematic for the Muslim because they contain Aramaic phrasing, so they must have originated in ancient Israel, modern-day Palestine, where the disciples are alive and preaching. Regardless of the rest of the evidence in the video, these almost prove that the apostolic community is not Muslim. For Paul to have corrupted all of Christian teaching requires a conspiracy beyond reasonable historical reality. It requires him to have corrupted theology of texts that are not associated with him and pre-Pauline creeds that were already established when he joined the movement. All while our Muslim disciples, they're alive, they're preaching, they're communicating, people think they know them, and people think they approve of them. I'm not in this video at least concerned that everything Paul preached 100% completely matches everything Jesus and the disciples taught. Rather the fact there are numerous evidences that he was generally endorsed, so as to suggest that he is completely making all of his theology up, especially on key points like crucifixion for sins, the resurrection, the divinity of Jesus. It's a bit ridiculous. Well, what about our other texts written alongside or after the New Testament for the next couple of 100 years? Do any of them align with Islam? Before we get into the real ancient evidence, I feel like you know it, you love it, I've got to mention it, the Gospel of Barnabas. This is a known medieval forgery written by Muslims, probably in Spain. Here's the weak manuscript evidence, here's its poor knowledge of ancient Judean geography, here it is quoting medieval books, and here it is contradicting the Qur'an anyway. So all of this just makes the Gospel of Barnabas completely unreasonable for you to appeal to, or if you're a Muslim, of course, as a genuine historical source. Right, anyway, that out the way, let's get into the real ancient evidence. We can split this into three categories, and we'll start in the 1st century and we'll move later into history. So in the 1st century, we have normative Christian texts. These just confirm the New Testament Christian beliefs, they don't support the Islamic ones at least, and these are the only ones from the 1st century. There are no 1st century sources about Jesus, about Christianity, that disagree with the New Testament. So you can make of that what you will, but we'll move on into the 2nd century where things get a bit more diverse. We keep a normative body of Christian works in the 2nd century, but other groups also start to appear. Gnostics are one such group, though they have too high a Christology, they deny the Old Testament God, they believe he's evil, which is obviously not consistent with Islam. Then we get a couple Jewish Christian groups. The Nazarenes are one such group. We know about these guys from excerpts of their gospel quoted by Jerome. It's essentially an edited version of the Gospel of Matthew, so we find things like they call Jesus the Son of God, they accept his death, they identify him as the Son of Man, and they seem to affirm the Holy Spirit in a Christian sense. The reason why these guys are considered Jewish is because they sit on the other side of that kosher debate than Paul that we looked at earlier, but they do not match Islamic theology. Then there's who are these guys? The Ebionites? The Ebionites?
Called Ebionites.
Other than the Ebionite tradition.
The Qur'an says.
Ebionites.
Ebionites and
Followers of Christ were called the Ebionites.
Christianity. Jewish Christianity is Islam.
Oh God. I haven't wasted all my time, have I? Right. What are our sources on the Ebionites? Let me look. Well, we have a few sources on what they believe. Irenaeus summarizes it best here. Kind of all the other sources agree on what he has to say. So what do we have? Jesus is crucified. Okay. The Messiah is God or some other spiritual being who possessed Jesus. Alright. And there's not even a virgin birth. Oh well, never mind then. No later source we find match Islamic theology, and anything we find after 200 AD, I mean, you got to question that anyway, right? So what does all this mean for the validity of Islam? What's the point I'm making? Well, Muslims have to reconcile the fact that the Qur'an claims the disciples of Jesus were faithful Muslims, with the fact that there is unanimous consensus in dozens of early sources from a community that they were part of that contradict this in many, many different ways, with no explanation to this in the Qur'an or in the Hadith. Or they could of course try to explain why a perfect book would be so misleading about the identity of the people it's talking about. my direct question to any Muslim audience members: can you provide a historically reasonable series of events to reconcile the Qur'an's claims about the disciples with the evidence? What could possibly have happened historically to give us this gap between what the Qur'an says and what the evidence shows? Now, I'm going to throw out a theory here that I think perfectly explains and easily answers that question. I think that because Arabia was largely Christian by the time of Muhammad's ministry, he wanted to appease these people and incorporate some of their beliefs into his own teaching. Therefore, he made claims about Jesus and his disciples that he didn't think were really verifiable to gain popularity points. But the claims he made are historically verifiable. We can check what Jesus and his disciples preached, and we find a deeply problematic contradiction. So that's it for this video. I feel like that was a bit of an info dump, to be honest. I'm just trying to make my point as best and clearly as I can. If I've missed anything, or you think you can answer this, you think you have an answer, you can reconcile all of this, let me know. You know I'm a nerd for this. I love engaging in this stuff. I loved all the comments on the last video, so please keep them coming. I'm not trying to offend you. I understand, especially at the end when I'm coming to my conclusion there. I get that that's quite a heavy thing for me to say. I understand that. To me, that just answers the question. That's an easy answer. Whereas if you take the Islamic perspective, I can't comprehend how you could solve this problem. But maybe you can. So please just let me know if you have an answer to this. And thank you for watching.